Mariana, Public Relations, the way for international and intercultural communication with our special guest, Dr. Professor Michael Leslie from University of Florida. First of all, we have greet for our Chief of International Issues, Rafael Calles Moreno. Welcome, Rafael.
Good morning for everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Jaime, for organizing this interesting activity for us. Also, thank you so much to Edwin Munoz, the director of the faculty, and also welcome to all the students that are today with us in this important masterclass. Also, my special greetings to Dr. Michael Leslie. Thank you so much for being with us in this interesting experience in which we are trying to recall the importance of internationalization of the curricula and also the approach to different activities using social media and also the ICT tools that we have. I want to recall three important messages and points before to start today. The first one, it's about public relations. In fact, daily, there are more than 3.5 million of search of social media and also public relations on Google. So it's quite important for you as social communication and journalism students to point out this interesting activity, because there is not only important public relations for all the students at UPB, but for us, it's a competitive advantage, and also it's mandatory to have that skill in terms of public relations. The second point is that this is an advantage in terms of public relations, not just for your personal background, but also in the professional point and also in the professional approach that you will start to point out as professionals. So in social media, in TV, in radio, in many other things as press, always public relations can cause a competitive advantage and also to point out as a high profile with very interest, not just for Colombian companies, but also to be a professional worldwide. And the third point is that this activity, it's 100% connected to the priority that we have at UPB Bucaramanga with internationalization. As you know, and also to point out this point with Dr. Michael Leslie, internationalization is one of the three top priorities of UPB now, currently, alongside sustainability and academic performance. So all these activities of internationalization have all the support of the university, of the board, of my office, trying to point out and to figure out how we can communicate and also to move these kind of skills and competences to all of you. So I wish all the best for this activity. Once again, thank you so much to all the team of the faculty, to all the students that are here at the classroom and also connected by YouTube, and a special greeting from Bucaramanga to Florida to Dr. Michael Leslie for being with us in this important masterclass. Thank you so much and all the success today.
Thank you very much, Rafael Calles Moreno, our Chief of International Issues in our university. Well, now we have the greet of our Director of Faculty of Social Communication and Journalism, Edwin Munoz Neira. Welcome, Edwin.
Morning, everybody. I will speak in Spanish. Maybe it's much more better for me. Bueno, muy buenos días a todos. Un saludo muy especial para los que nos acompañan a través también de YouTube. Esta conferencia que nos da hoy el doctor Michael Leslie, pues es algo muy interesante que hemos querido nosotros también querer impactar en nuestra facultad, y es empezar a que nuestros currículos se internacionalicen. Como lo decía Rafa, nuestro director de Relaciones Internacionales, es una apuesta que nosotros estamos llevando a cabo. La interculturalidad y la internacionalización de nuestros currículos es algo prioritario. Nos lo está pidiendo también la academia, y como tal, pues es algo que a nosotros pues lo tenemos en primera línea. Segundo, pues quiero agradecerle al doctor Michael Leslie por su deferencia, por estar con nosotros acompañándonos desde Miami. Es una persona muy erudita, conocedora de todos estos temas que tienen que ver con internacionalización, con relaciones públicas, con comunicación, y agradecerle también al profesor Jaime Payares por ese contacto que ha hecho con el doctor Michael Leslie. Esperamos que próximamente el doctor Michael nos pueda acompañar presencialmente acá en la universidad a través de pues, los diferentes convenios que podemos establecer con las ayudas internacionales también que hemos gestionado, pues posiblemente podamos tenerlo acá presencialmente como profesor visitante. Es como una apuesta también que nos estamos poniendo en meta, y es empezar también a tener docentes e investigadores que nos aporten a toda la formación de la facultad. Un saludo pues a todos, bienvenidos, y espero que puedan aprovechar muchísimo este momento, este espacio diseñado especialmente para todos ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Thank you to Edwin Munoz Neira, our Director of Faculty of Social Communication and Journalism here at UPB Bucaramanga. And remember, you can follow us in the YouTube channel UPB VGA and hear this broadcasting. I'm so glad to introduce you Dr. Professor Michael Leslie. He is Associate Professor and Department of Media Production, Management and Technology Global Leadership Trainer at the University of Florida. Dr. Leslie teaches graduate courses in international and intercultural communication and race, gender, class, and media, and conducts cross-cultural research on the impact of media content on society. At the undergraduate level, he teaches courses in advanced writing for electronic media, ethics, and race and media. Dr. Leslie served as a Fulbright professor at University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, Africa, from 1987 to 1989, and as a lecturer in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of Zambia, Africa, in 1984 to 1987. Additionally, he has taught, lived, or done research in Belgium, France, South Africa, Mexico, and Brazil. Professor Leslie speaks, reads, and writes in English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. In addition to this, in his Washington philosophical doctor, Dr. Leslie holds an M.S. from Columbia University and has published his research in the Howard Journal of Communication, the Journal of Afro-Latin American Studies and Literatures, African Media Review and Journalism, and Mass Communication Quarterly. He was awarded the Stephen H. Colton Award for Excellence in Communication Education in 1997. Dr. Michael Leslie is philosophical doctor in international communication from the University of Washington, Seattle. M.S.J. for broadcast journalism in Columbia University in New York, and B.A. in political science at University of California in Berkeley. One of them publications are academic book with Goran Hayden and Follow Ojindumi, Communication and Democracy in Africa, Transition Publishers in New Jersey, 2002. Personal book, Be Who You Really Are, Create Space Independent Publishing Platform in Charleston in 2014. Another academic book chapters, The Internet and Democratization in Africa, The Case of Zambia in Communication and Democracy, Goran Hayden, Michael Leslie, and Follow F. The Representation of Blacks on Commercial Television in Brazil, Same Cultivation Effects in Black Brazil, Culture, Identity, and Social Mobilization with Larry Crook and Randall Johnson. From UCLA, Latin American Center publication from University of California, Los Angeles. Mass Communication and Development, A Critical View in Developing Areas, a book of readings, Vihijan Pillai and Lyle Shannon in Rhode Island. And finally, Television and the Cultivation of Modern Racism, The Case of Brazil, from the Journal of Afro-Latin American Studies and Literatures. So welcome, Professor Leslie, and once again, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. We can hear you.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm also grateful for the presence of academic leaders at your university and for the honor of being able to speak with your students. I think the students always come first, at least for me, in these events. So welcome students also to this lecture. I prepared something. I was asked to prepare something for you on journalism, communication, in particular, the role of public relations in international and intercultural communications. So I prepared some slides that we can use as a beginning for a talk like this one. And then I'm sure you will have some questions. I don't know what access you have to direct access you might have to microphones, but como yo hablo español también, entonces pueden hacer sus preguntas en español, en inglés es igual para mí. So we'll do this lecture in English. I'm sure that will be useful and helpful to you as you develop your own linguistic skills in international and intercultural communication. So let me see if I can pull up my slides. And we should be able to proceed. Okay, I see that. Oh, there they are. Good, perfect. Okay, great. So let's see if I can get this something. I have a little box here that's bothering me. Let me see if I can get it out of the way. There, that might be it. So I want to start off just by saying a few words about, the role of public relations. So, public relations for most of us is understood as institution to institution communication. It can also be an internal kind of public relations in which you speak to your staff, the people in your organization, present a view of the organization to the people that work within the organization, so that they understand better what the organization is doing, what it wants to accomplish. But in today's lecture, we want to talk about communicating with external publics. That's what we mean by international communication, especially external publics outside of our own country. And then we want to talk about the intercultural aspects of that. That is, those influences that impact how those messages that we're communicating are interpreted by people who don't belong to our culture, who perhaps don't even share our values, but that we have to or want to interact with around the world. So we can say that in that context, the role of public relations is to shape perceptions, how you are seen, how your company is seen, how your country is seen in the minds and in the eyes of others. We also want to recognize that this public relations activity, this communication activity, I would call it, also can build relationships that did not exist. For example, today I heard in the introduction, one of your professors mentioned, one of your leaders in your institution mentioned that you might want to have a relationship between your university and other universities around the world. So if that's important, if that's going to happen, then other people would have to see you as a desirable partner, right? You're internationalizing, you have faculty who speak English, you also have students who speak English, you're doing cutting edge work with technology. All of that's part of the public relations effort to build relationships with others, right? And then, of course, what we're speaking about today is how can you adjust the communications content, I'm going to call it the strategies, so that it meets the need of different audiences. And in particular, we could start by saying, there's still something here that's on my screen that's bothering me. Let me go back one, excuse me. Yeah. You can see my screen clearly, is that correct? There's nothing overlaying it? I think I can, if there were, you would have told me by now. Okay, so the tailoring of the message to diverse audiences is very important because, talking to people in, say, my experience at least, talking to people in on the African continent is different from talking to people in Europe, is different from communicating with people in Latin America. And we could go on with examples like this. So, of course, Asia, we don't want to leave that out. There's different audiences and they need to be communicated with in different ways for our public relations effort or our communications effort to be successful. Great. So that's the introduction to this. So what is it that we're actually doing? Well, besides building relationships, we want to maintain those relationships. Over time, what happens is we're changing in our own environment. For example, you might be having, well, let's use some examples that you can relate to. The Venezuelan context has changed over time, right? So there's a very important that Venezuela find a way to present itself to international audiences in a new way, right? And one that which they understand the processes that are taking place within the country, and also that they understand that the relationships that you want to make sure that those endure. You don't want to build relationships and then have them go away. There's a lot of expense, a lot of money, a lot of time that becomes nothing, because things do change over time. So you have to find ways to maintain that communication. Sometimes that's with, for example, an in-person visit, which is what was talked about today. To actually, be before you is different from a relationship that we have by Zoom, right? The second point here is why PR is important, is that you can help me understand you. And when I say that, I mean someone outside will have a better understanding of you, right? If you learn something about how I'm different from the way you are. My historical experience might be different. Certainly my economic experience is probably different than yours. And of course, you have a political system that's not the same as mine. You probably even have cultural habits, like things that you like to do as a way of relating to each other that are different from the way I relate to people in my culture. And, we'll have some examples here forthcoming, but I just want to stay on this for just a minute. If you don't understand the person that you're speaking with culturally, if you don't understand the difference, then you're going to be very ineffective in communicating, and vice versa if they don't understand you. Usually this leads to friction. Sometimes it leads to wars, economic wars, actual wars. Okay, and then number three, of course, this is a very complex thing to do. Complex not because it's I wouldn't say difficult. It's just that there's so many factors you have to be aware of. Again, just briefly, politics, economics, society, religion, broadly speaking, ways of living life, like what's important in life. Some people think it's, the French, for example, there's a saying that they work in order to live. You work in order to live. And the French talk about my Americans, people like me, and that we live in order to work, right? Work in order to live, to enjoy your life, to have fun. And then the others, no, I'm here to make a lot of money. That's my function here, not to enjoy myself, but to create capital, right? And then sometimes there's a mix of the two. But my point is, it's a very complex environment. The women in some societies, their status, their relationship with the other gender is different, right? It's not all the same. We're not all the same. So it's complex. That's my point. Okay, great. Let's move on to the next slide, because I'm sure you'll have some questions that might be more useful to you. So here we are. There's what are the challenges? I said it was complex. Well, here are some of the challenges. The first one, of course, is many of us, in fact, for most people have not really had much exposure to other cultures than their own, or they've had minimal exposure. For example, some, in my case, I've had opportunities to actually live abroad for extended periods. When I say extended periods, anything from 6 months to several years, I've been able to live in other environments. And so I have developed some sensitivity to those cultures that I've lived in as a sojourner, as a guest, if you would. So, and you can only get those sensitivities, I think, if you spend some time in that culture. You can't just read it in a book. You have to actually have learned, expose yourself, immerse yourself in another culture, and you might learn something about how that culture is different from your own and how you need to adjust your behavior, your communication, even your thinking, right, about that culture, because now you've learned what or how they think that's different from your own way of thinking. Cultural sensitivity. There's language barriers, obviously, right? So you guys are very ahead of the, I say, ahead of the game because you're doing this in English. That's brilliant. I was prepared to speak to you in Spanish. You're doing this in English. When I go to and one of the things that's been really helpful and I think essential is you must learn the language of another culture. Learn French, learn German, learn Italian, learn another language. And English has become very useful because it's an international language, business language in particular, right? And it helps you to navigate, to move, to understand, to negotiate, and to feel comfortable. I have friends who've lived abroad for many years, or their parents have lived abroad, and they never learn the language. They come, for example, to the United States, they never learn English. So they're always going to have a very limited understanding of American culture because they haven't learned the language of the culture, right? So language barriers. Third is media landscapes. Well, I'll say just a little bit about this, but you know, in some countries, the media is highly government controlled, and I would say, you know, government censored. But let's put it that way. We have, and I'm not saying that the media here is not government controlled. What we have the concept of, you know, independent media funded by capital, right? And that's different, right? There's some limitations on what you can say or not say, what will get you into trouble with the host government or even with in the commercial environment, where there's a lot of competition, multiple media outlets, social media, radio, television, film. I mean, you know, the media landscapes are different, right? One of the things I was noticed in my travels is that some countries have a well-developed film industry and others don't. Everything that they see, images of other countries, come from other countries. They don't have a way of constructing their own images in film of themselves. So I, for example, and many people in my country have a very distorted view of Colombia, right? Because what we learn in our media landscapes is Colombia is full of people who are involved in drugs, and it's very dangerous to be there. And all of that stuff is created by how our media are organized, which is they're organized as a way of making money, right? And you do in media what's necessary to generate money, not necessarily to generate understanding or cross-cultural communication, right? Although there is communication in a certain way. Then there's the political and legal strengths, which I think sometimes overlap, but it's very difficult, for example, in my country at the moment, and not just now, but let's talk about the moment. It's very difficult to obtain reliable information about what is happening now in Gaza with the Palestinians and the Israelis. Very difficult because our government looks at anyone who is informing about the rights of Palestinians as someone who's working against the government's intent, right? So you become, you know, it's politically, it's not very easy to advocate for the rights of Palestinian people right now in the United States. This is every situation, every every time in history, there's always been the political environment and then how we communicate in that environment and externally. In some ways, it's very important, you know, to be supporting the goals of your government, right? And not to be working against them, even if you don't agree with the goals of your government. So there's that piece. And then there's legal constraints. where it's very difficult also for something like, I'm going to think of Al Jazeera, which is a Middle Eastern news agency, to operate within the United States. Just like it's difficult for, say, CBS probably to operate within, which country shall we pick? Pakistan, right? So, there are legal constraints on what the media can do. China is a very good example also, which will come up in our later in this lecture. China has legal constraints that it places on social media, right? So there's certain things that even if you wanted to communicate them, you would probably run into difficulty with the Chinese government if you tried to do that. And, and then there's ethical considerations. Now, my experience in Latin America and other places, but particularly Latin America, because I did a lot of work in Mexico earlier in my career, is that it's common, let's say just common, for journalists to receive some kind of payment from their sources. So if you have a message that you want to get out and you wanted to get it out through radio or television, you probably pay somebody or give them a gratuity, as we would say, to help move your story along or your media communication along. That's common. Here, that's looked down upon as corruption, right? Corruption of the media. I'm not saying that all Latin American media are like this. I'm just saying that in the ethical consideration, it's, well, the reporter has to make a living, right? And the source has an objective, right? So let's, what can I do for you? Well, what can you do for me? So there's some exchange of interest, sometimes financial, sometimes some kind of consideration, like, well, we won't go into that until we go to later. All right, great. So that's what we're talking about. It's challenging to do our work because of these kinds of situations, barriers, the complexity of the system in which we need to operate. So I want to talk about now some approaches that we can use. So there's when you have a problem, then you say, okay, well, how can I do this? That's what we call strategy. How can I, despite the environment, despite the constraints, despite my limitations, despite the politics, despite the culture, what can I do? How can I do this? So the first thing is to begin to understand and adapt. So I can't use the same communication strategies that I would use here, or you can't, than that you would use if you were in, I spent some time in Zambia, for example. So some things that I would do here won't work there. In fact, there are even subjects that some of you are aware that in some countries, not all of them, we're not going to make this, we're not going to stereotype, right? But we know that attitudes, for example, towards homosexuality are different in different countries, right? Here in the US, it's somewhat liberal. I wouldn't say very, but somewhat liberal compared to, for example, a place where you can be executed if you are homosexual, right? So, you have to understand that things aren't not going to be the same as where you come from, and you want to adjust your communications accordingly. The role, Procter & Gamble's an example. When they had a campaign in Japan, what they thought was funny, the Japanese didn't think was funny, right? So you're making allusions, you're making comments about something that goes on. I've heard a lot of people tell jokes about women, right? And that might work in, I don't know, some places, but it certainly wouldn't work in the US. You would be accused of being a sexist, right? So I think you get the point. You have to adjust your content and your communication to what the local environment says. And that's what we call being intelligent, culturally intelligent. You understand what the local values are and what would be accepted and what would not be accepted. this is another example of the need to localize the messages. When you in the Coca-Cola campaign, sharing a Coke, right, um, would be it's a nice idea to share something, but you might have to give it a name of something that people can relate to in the sharing process, like share this particular star, this particular person that's known in the culture, right? That people, they can relate to because it's from their culture, as opposed to sharing something from my culture, which none of you could identify. I used to, when I was earlier in my career, I used to give examples of people and places and things that were popular in the United States, but not necessarily popular in, where, again, I spend a lot of time in Cameroon. They weren't popular in Cameroon. Cameroon had its own popular people. And in fact, some of the more popular people were from France, not from the United States, right? So I had to learn, who's important in this culture, localizing the communication to the culture so that people can relate. It's very important also that, yes, you want to promote your brand, right? Whether it be Procter and Gamble or McDonald's or what's Apple computers or what's popular nowadays outside of that. You'll tell me when we are in our discussion session. But used to be Michael Jackson was one of the people that was a popular culture commodity that traveled well internationally. You could use that to help you get across a message, right? Like that. But also there's the local aspect. So McDonald's is, always talks about the beef. And American companies like to talk about the beef in the hamburger, the beef, what else? The double cheeseburger, all of this, but it's burger, right? And people think meat. And then in India, it's not, you don't eat cows. That's prohibited. That's a sacred animal, right? So you can still have the McDonald's brand, but you might sell something else like a vegetarian option to beef, right? So, you want to make sure that you're still carrying your brand name and how we're quality and how we're fast and how we're also popular and how we're universal, that, people want to participate in something that's universal, but they also want you to be in sync with their beliefs about what should or should not be done. And in this case, it was, we don't eat meat, or we don't, well, maybe some meats, but certainly not cows. Those are individuations of God in some aspects of Indian culture. Okay, enough of that. This is another example from Starbucks, which I've seen pretty much everywhere I've gone. Yeah, I know I've seen it in Colombia too. So, and by the way, I just finished spending 8 months in Colombia. So I had some understanding, developed some, not perfect, but some understanding of differences in Colombia and the US. And one of them in the US, coffee, right? I know you have great coffee. I love your coffee, by the way. And it's in the US, it's very important. How is the coffee being sourced? Where's this coffee coming from? Right? And what are the conditions under which the people who supply the coffee work? I mean, some people are getting paid like nothing or next to nothing to produce the coffee that we drink in the United States. And Starbucks was accused of exploiting farmers. So, and their stock value went down because people want to be associated with ethical companies, right? So your public relations, your job is to make sure that that Starbucks continues to look like a reputable, ethical company abroad and even here. And so Starbucks embarked on a campaign to work with the local farmers to improve their standard of living, to make sure that they were working on places where they were at least being paid a decent or minimal wage, right, for a decent living. They've advertised that as part of their brand, that we are ethical, that we we're fair, right? Like that. So that's one way to that, and they recovered their reputation. Instead of being seen as exploitative, they're seen now Starbucks. Oh, in some places, Starbucks is a good company, right? Like that. All right, now this is the part where your world is, I believe, is on digital platforms. Some of us, as your certainly your university, your professors are, very well attuned to this need to move everything onto digital platforms, because that's where the world is now. That's where this conversation is taking place, on a digital platform. So it allows, this is in real time what people are synced to, your age especially. I assume you're younger people, mostly younger than me at least. Your world is in social media, right? And so anything that's related to communicating about a company's brand definitely has to be in social media, right? So there was I don't know if you're aware of this, but we had a situation here where the Galaxy Note phone book was catching fires, spontaneous fires. In fact, they were prohibited on airplanes for a while in the United States because it's a defective product that could cause an accident, a health concern, a tragedy, right? And so where did Samsung work to recover its reputation? And as we recall, they recalled the phones, that's to begin with, and they used digital media to get the word out to everyone, right? Because millions of people, are on social media now, so you have to be there. If you're doing anything, you have to be on a digital platform and communicating via social media. And they use that to recover their reputation as we're a responsible company. We make products that people can rely on. And most of all, you can count on us to address whatever concerns you have with the product that we're producing, right? And I don't think, it looks to me like Samsung has completely recovered its brand value because they've known how to communicate about it with a well-articulated PR strategy, international PR strategy. Okay, I think this kind of repeats what I said before, but I've noticed here that there's a little bit more. So it's also the religious preference. So it's not just that people don't want to eat beef. It's maybe, well, some people don't want to eat pork, right? And maybe some people, we're not all Christians. We're not all Muslims. We're not all Jewish. We're not all animist. We're not all Shintoist. I mean, there's so many ways in which people have beliefs about life and what happens after we die. And if you're not, if you're thinking they think the way you do about religion, then you're going to be very limited in your ability to communicate with them. So that's a point about McDonald's. It really made this effort to adjust to the local environment. Okay, good. All right. This didn't move for some reason. Let's see. There we go. You're all aware of the British petroleum oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. That was several years ago now. That was a major disaster. Here in the US, it was beaches, prime beaches, in Florida. I live in Florida, so I'm very close to all of this that happened. In the Gulf of Mexico, billions of you would use liters, we use gallons of oil were spilled onto the beaches here in Florida. I mean, these are beaches, international. Florida is known for its beaches. That's our tourism economy is based on that. We get most of our revenue from tourism, at least almost a half, a third of our revenue from tourism. And so, but this is not just a problem for Florida. This is a problem for Gulf. BP has oil rigs around the world. People get very nervous about you having a rig in the middle of their ocean off the coast, right? And you are maybe irresponsible in your drilling activities. What do you think that impact would be on getting licenses, drilling licenses in Africa, for example, or in the North Sea, for example? So they had to really engage in a massive public relations campaign to reestablish themselves or reestablish themselves as a responsible company, right? It's not going to damage the environment. But beyond that, is beyond the campaign, they also had to pay some money, right, to compensate the victims. Florida is still using money settlement from the BP oil spill to clean the beaches here. They're still polluted, right? Sea life died. So and animals were also impacted. So what I'm emphasizing here is your work as public relations professionals is critical, key in maintaining healthy, cordial relationships between institutions, between companies, between governments. I've also noticed recently, although I'm sure it's been around for a while, but now it seems to be more prominent, that Colombia has a PR campaign for Colombia, right? And that you can see on the television in the United States, come to Colombia, right? So these things exist in an environment in which organizations must maintain their reputations. Starbucks, returning to that again, is now it says that it is helping local farmers in Colombia, in Ethiopia, in Africa, right? So that it is more acceptable as a brand, because there are many people sell coffee, right? But why would you go to Starbucks? Well, Starbucks is fair. They're honest. They help. There's a bank, international bank, that had said something that was misinterpreted culturally. They used I think this is in Spanish, no asumes nada. That's probably a very bad translation, right? But people thought that meant you could be wrong. You shouldn't trust the bank, right? Don't trust us. No asumes que somos legales, ¿verdad? O somos éticos. Y se interpretó como no hagas nada, right? That's translational error. That's another area in which our work, when we do public relations campaigns, we have to be careful in translating what it is we say. All right, we've talked about this already. I'm not going to talk about that because it's too old.
Excuse me,
Ikea.
Mr. Levy.
Yes.
Mr. Levy,
Yes,
can we ask to you some questions?
of course.
Okay, thank you very much for this very important speech. And now, Professor, it's time for my students. They try to challenge this language barrier, and they try to ask to you some question in English. I have 7 students in my subject of public relations. So please, ladies, come here and ask to Professor Michael Leslie your question. Okay, we have the first time Maria Alejandra. Welcome.
Good morning, Dr. Leslie.
Good morning.
My question is, what is the biggest mistake companies often make when communicating with audience from different cultures?
Well, I think the biggest mistake is coming back to assumptions. So, for me to think that when I'm speaking with you, that you have the same values or that you have the same interest even that I have. It's the assumptions we make about other people that get us into trouble. So that's the biggest, I would call it ignorance. The biggest mistake is not knowing who you're talking to and what might be their concerns.
Okay, thank you very much.
Now we have Paula.
Hi, Mr. Leslie.
Hello, Paula.
My question is, what advice would you give to improve intercultural communication in diverse work teams?
Well, I think again, it's very close to the previous conversation or previous question. We, in the United States, for example, and I think in many countries, you have not only in our country, for example, you have people who call themselves white, people who call themselves Latino, people who call themselves Asians, people who call themselves Black, people who say that they're not going to tell you what they are. They have maybe they feel that they're a mixture of different racial entities or identities, excuse me. So if you're only communicating with one race, then you're missing what other people are in the country. In our country, it's very diverse. The population is very diverse. So what you need to do is investigate, learn. I've spent much of my career studying Afro-descendant people in Colombia, Afro-descendant people in Ecuador, Afro-descendant people in Brazil, in South Africa, right? So I wanted to understand differences because I already understand American culture pretty well, but I want to understand how people in other places, what they think. And just because they look like me, maybe they have this skin color, but they don't think like me. They think quite differently. So my point is you have to study, learn the culture, the people, the gastronomy, the lifestyle of people that you want to communicate with and not assume that they're all the same.
Thank you, Mr.
You're welcome, Paula.
Thank you. Now we have Catalina. Welcome, Catalina.
Hi, Mr. Leslie, and thank you for sharing your knowledge today. So my question is, considering the rise of misinformation across borders, what measure can be taken to ensure that international communication remains transparent and truthful while respecting cultural diversity?
Well, that's a more difficult question to answer, but I'll take some possibilities. I think when people who are like yourselves need to have organizations need to have people who are trained like yourselves in aspects and the distinctions and the challenges uh, in intercultural and international communication. So the organizations themselves need to make sure that they have the staff that's qualified to communicate about these issues. That's number one. The second is, I think you want to make sure that you have a robust, nowadays, if you have a robust social media influencers that can protest, right? That can make some noise, that can, reverse communicate, if you would, about the communications they're receiving. What's happening now in the U.S. is that some of the social media outlets are beginning to talk about what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, right? So that's raised the kind of the profile, if you would, or the sensitivity of Americans to, okay, we didn't hear about this on ABC, CNN, NBC. We didn't hear about it in the major outlets, but now we're hearing from the social media that there's something needs to be done. And now it's being picked up by the major media. So I think that would be the second access is what I call social media influence on major media communications.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Valentina.
Good morning, Dr. Leslie. I have one question for you. Is what impact do you hope your publications will have in the field of public relations and intercultural communication?
Well, when I was younger, say, closer to your age, I thought that I would have a lot of impact on international intercultural communication. I'm more humble now. I don't think that I'm going to have that great of an impact. But here's what I can say. When the work that I did, and this is now many years ago, I did some early work on communication in Brazil uh, in the telenovelas in Brazil, and I'm sure maybe in Colombia. The representation of Afro-descendant people was not very good. And I wrote about that, and it got published, and other people talked about it. And, we began a conversation about people need to be more sensitive to racism within their own countries, right? And so now that conversation is very elevated, at least in Brazil. And when I was in Colombia, I could see that it was significantly more elevated. It's not so elevated, say, for example, in Ecuador, right? But that's the contribution when you do academic work, when you publish, as you said, publications. It's not something that impacts today, right? But it might impact you as students tomorrow. And then you might say something to other people. And before you know it, we have a community of people who are talking about a problem, as in, well, what's going on now in Gaza? There are people talking about that now. This is something that people need to address, right? So that would be the impact, I think, starting conversations that before did not exist.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And now we have Mayra. Welcome, Mayra.
Good morning, Dr. Leslie. My
Good
question
morning.
is, Dr. Leslie, since you master several languages and have taught in multicultural context, how do you think multilingualism influences the effectiveness in intercultural communication and the interpretation of media messages in different cultures?
Okay, well, there's two things I can say. One of them is that if you can, or let me say this in a different way, you have no access or very limited access to understanding another culture if you don't have the language. Um, Listen, I think the United States is an example. We had practically no one who could speak Arabic when we were in various wars, and we still are, with people from that region of the world, from the Middle East. And then the government realized, hey, if we could understand the language, we better train some people. The government got involved in training people to speak Arabic, to read Arabic, because what? They needed to decode messages, and they also needed to send messages that weren't in English, right? And that were the translation or the interpretation was done by someone who actually was an expert in translation and interpretation. Some people understand other languages, but they understand them in a very limited range. And so they can't really convey the feeling, the culture, the meaning of the communicator to a target audience because they don't have that skill. They don't have the linguistic skill. So I hope that answers in part your question. People need, it's absolutely necessary. It's not a luxury. You have to be able to speak in the language, or at least to communicate effectively in the language of the people that you're trying to communicate with.
Thank you, Dr. Leslie.
Now we have Dana.
Hi, Mr. Leslie.
Hello.
My question is, how has your experience in international and intercultural communication influenced the development of your research and publication? And what advice will you give to students seeking to apply this concept in their professional careers?
Okay, well, I think what my research led me to was to understand that I understood very little. Sometimes you think you're an expert in something, and then you realize when you study it, when you actually study, you realize that you have a lot more to learn. So what it did for me, I started my work in Mexico when I was a PhD student. I did some work on communication and international communication in Mexico. And then I said, well, okay, I understand this, but I don't understand Africa. So I trained myself so that I could go to Africa. I trained myself, meaning I learned to speak French so I could go to Africa and work. And then when I was in Africa and I worked on that for a while, I said, well, I don't understand Europe. So I decided that I should go to Europe and spend some time teaching there and learning from students there. And then once I was in Europe, it was like, oh, I don't understand China. So let me go to China. So then I prepared myself to go to China. And so my work has taken me, the intellectual interest in communication and how it works led me to different places to study. That's the value of studying, is that you realize what you still need to learn, and then you find a way to learn that thing. Was that a helpful answer to your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And now we have Angie.
Hello, Mr. Michel. I have one question. Adapting to a new culture is always difficult, and it is possible that mistakes are made when communication due to difference in language and culture. How should we respond if, when interacting with a new audience, we are incapable of connect with it due to cultural and language reasons?
Yeah, this is great. Great, excellent question. So here's a method that almost always works. Almost always. So it's called reproduction. So when I speak to you, I will say, what did you understand? And then you will tell me what you understood. And then I can see if the communication actually got across, right? And then you will speak to me and I'll say to you, reproduce what you said. And you will say whether or not did I get it? Did I get it correctly, or did I get it incorrectly? So that's the way, the only way for you to know is to ask the person or organization or people you're communicating with, what did you understand from what I said? Then they will tell you, and then you can see if you actually were understood. It's called reproduction. And I would do that in normal conversations, like, that's why I asked you, did that answer your question? And then you'll say yes or no, and then we can try again. I hope that's helpful to you.
Thanks, Mr. Michel. Michael.
Okay, Professor Leslie, how is your time? We can ask to you another couple of questions.
Oh, we're fine. No problem here.
Okay, thank you. So we have Angela.
Well, hi, Mr. Leslie.
Hello.
I want to know, how can success an international or intercultural communication strategy be measured? Because you explained to us this chance in the large companies, but in the case of the companies that are not so large.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. How do you measure it?
Yes, like in the small companies, how we can success of an international or intercultural communication strategy be measured.
Oh, I see. Yes, thank you. Well, I don't know that. Well, one way to measure it directly is by the results. Are you having more international companies, for example, who want to do business with you? Are you being noticed as someone that is a desirable business partner, for example? So I have, in my experience here, I get a significant amount of inquiries from people who want to either know more about me or about my university. And some of them, it's clear that they have not done any research on me or my university. They know nothing about me. And they're asking me, I think, I'll give you a concrete. People ask me, well, I'm a technology firm. Can you help me find, technological opportunities? Well, I don't, I'm not in technology, right? So it's clear to me that they don't know, they haven't done any research. So if even a small company can have someone whose job it is to do the research for the company or the entity that they want to be in communication with, that they understand, you're talking to people at UNESCO. Well, you better know something about UNESCO, right? Or you're talking to people in France. You better know something about France. It can't be just a pitch, just talking. It has to be contextualized so that people know that you understand, or at least are attempting to understand them.
And another questions, I want to know how we can develop that cultural intelligence for diverse companies in diverse, I don't know, like factories. I think that is a good word. Like how we can develop that cultural intelligence that you talk in the past explication.
Yeah. My priority answer to that is someone, even if it's a small company, someone should have the job of, or in the opportunity, if you're serious about it, the opportunity to travel to one of the places where you think is a target market. I produced for myself the opportunity to travel to various countries and places. That's why I can talk about them, because I've actually been there, right? So my answer to your question is yes, someone should actually be given the opportunity, you might say, to spend some time abroad. Even if you only go one place for 3 months or 6 months, your whole perspective on your world changes because you've been outside of your world. You see it from a different angle. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you, Mr. Leslie.
You're welcome.
We have 3 more questions, Professor Leslie. Now we have Alejandra.
Hello, Mr. Leslie.
Hello, Alejandra.
My question is, how do you think new digital platforms are changing intercultural communication, especially regarding race and gender representation?
Right. Well, okay. If you're specific about it, that's specific. Thank you for that specificity. I think now people who did not have a voice before, or did not have access is the key. I mean, before, access was more highly controlled. So only certain people were given the opportunity to speak. Now, just about anyone with some minimal technological expertise can have a podcast, or they can have a website, or they can have a radio station. In some cases, you can have a television station. Well, YouTube is a good example of that, right? So, there's opportunities for people who don't have the resources that major enterprises have to speak, to get the word out. And if you develop some sophistication, you can get that word out to large numbers of people, not just to your friends, right? If you train yourself to use the platforms that are available. So that's been my experience. Women, for example, in this country, we call minorities, which are people, who are not white. That's what we call them here, white. But if you don't belong to those groups, you have opportunities now that you never would have had before. Look at what I'm doing. I would never have had this opportunity if it wasn't for technology, right? And so that's what I would say. Take it. Look, I'm gonna shorten this because I know you have 1 or 2 other people who maybe want to ask me something. But here's what I can say about regarding Afro descendants, women, people who have been excluded before, now have the opportunity, learn coding, learn Python, learn Google Analytics, learn marketing, right? Digital marketing, right? So, and all of that's available. You don't have to pay for this. You can get it online, free, right? So that's what my advice would be, is to get the skills that would allow you to communicate internationally and interculturally.
Thank you, Mr. Leslie.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have Ana Maria.
Good morning, Dr. Leslie. I have a class called Knowledge Society, where we talk about globalization and interculturality. Based on this, what do you think that are 3 key foundations that we, as students of social communication and journalism, should have in order to improve our capacity for global communication?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to think about this one more time. Number one, you need to have language. You got to, I appreciate that you're speaking English to me, but how about getting a third language? How about French or German, or what's popular nowadays seems to be
Mandarin.
There you go. Mandarin. I am a student. I am a student of Mandarin. Now, I take classes every day in Mandarin because it's necessary. If we're going to live in, if I live another 10 years, well, I think the Chinese will have a greater presence now in the United States than they have today. So it's necessary, right? So language is the foundation. The second, you must get some intercultural immersive experience. Go somewhere, anywhere. Go somewhere outside of your culture so you can see yourself differently. That's number two. And then the second is research on cultural characteristics. There's a bibliography for this talk that I can send you if you want. But you need to read, you need to study, you need to people have been working on this a long time. So you need to do that. You need to put the energy necessary, the work necessary into learning about other cultures. Those 3 things.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You too.
Okay, Dr. Leslie, I have a question in Spanish if you gave us the permission to ask
Sure.
you in Spanish. Okay, but before, Dr. Leslie, I want to ask to you, because I'm very interested in your researches and racism, because there are racism in Colombia and people don't like to talk about this. But for example, we have our vice president, Francia Marquez, received a lot of bullying because she is an Afro-American woman. What do you think about this situation here in Colombia? Because we have racism in Colombia.
Well, I actually, as you know, I did some work with Luis Carlos Castillo. He's a professor and dean at Universidad del Valle.
Yes, in Cali.
In Cali, yes. And we worked together for a number of months on this issue of Francia Marquez. What are my thoughts about this? Well, I given that racism is a phenomenon, just like sexism is a phenomenon, right? Yeah. It's and you mentioned that people don't want to recognize it. I mean, it's not convenient to recognize it, right? So what is there to do? Well, we think that it would be very good to have an observatory on racism in the media. So, you can sort of, you can pick out, if you would, where the racism is what's being said, who's saying it. Is it coming from private individuals? Is it coming from, the dominant press? Is it coming from the weekly magazines? You can look to see where it's showing up and who is saying it. And then you can also you can observe qué tan frecuente es esa expresión de racismo. You can also then say, oh, ¿cuáles son las expresiones más populares racistas que aparecen en los medios de comunicación? So you can track, all of this and then present it. Ya cuando tienes información que se puede adquirir por inteligencia artificial, análisis de textos, análisis de comunicados, análisis del contenido de la radio, la televisión, etcétera. Ya cuando tienes todo en mano, organizado, o sea, por un mes, bueno, un mes no, sería por 6 meses o un año. Entonces, presentar esa información a la gente que maneja los medios de comunicación, que ellos se den cuenta de lo que están haciendo, concientizando a la gente de lo que está haciendo. Y de ahí comienza ese tipo de plática que nosotros estamos teniendo ahora. Bueno, ¿qué es lo que podemos? Ahora que reconocemos que sí existe, porque lo tenemos documentado, ahora, ¿qué podemos hacer con esa información? ¿Cómo es que queremos ir para adelante? That would be my idea.
Exactly. We don't have people in the director boards Afro-descendants, for example, in any company in Colombia.
Yeah. And that's another, that's an, Professor Jaime, that's a perfect example. And I'll give you, in the US, what people had to do here, and I think, creo que también se puede hacer en Colombia, that data, look, we have 10 or 100 companies. No one is at the top is Afro-descendant. No one, nadie es mujer. No one at the vice president, nadie. At the administrative level, 2, compared to maybe 200,000, It's also the thing in, pasa lo mismo en las universidades. Mira, yo estuve yo no conozco completamente la situación en Colombia, pero sé que hay muy pocos con doctorados en las universidades. En Brasil, lo que hicieron con ese caso es acción afirmativa para enseñar, o sea, formar más profesores afrodescendientes. Un programa gubernamental para aumentar el número de doctorados afro, ¿verdad? Y también indígena. Esas cosas se pueden medir, no es una cosa de que estamos inventando. Bueno, vamos contando en todas las universidades del país cuántos somos o no
It's
somos.
not a romantic issue, it's the data.
Perfect. That's it. This is a reality. It's a reality, right? Yes, thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you. Now we have the question in Spanish, Dr. Leslie. We have Johan Jair.
All right, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Leslie.
Hello.
Bueno, la pregunta la pregunta mía va dirigida más que todo a las relaciones públicas en cuanto al tema de la globalización y el tema de lo que es las corporaciones, más que todo lo que se nombraba como Ford, Starbucks y todas esas compañías. Principalmente, cómo las relaciones públicas pueden ayudar a que la empresa mantenga una fidelización hacia los clientes y que esta misma fidelización se conviertan en unas ventas o se conviertan en potenciales clientes, y de cómo nosotros con las empresas podemos mejorar esas relaciones públicas con esos públicos objetivos o posibles públicos.
Bueno, yo creo que lo que hay 2 o 3 maneras como estrategia, ¿verdad? Primero, yo creo que dependiendo del público, hay que tener representación de ese público en los mensajes comunicativos de relaciones públicas. Por ejemplo, las universidades aquí, lo que han hecho es promover la gente que pertenece a esos públicos. Por ejemplo, los indígenas, afrodescendientes, mujeres, están representados dentro de la comunicación. O sea, es muy convincente que tú veas a otra persona de tu clase, de tu etnia, de tu grupo social, de tu cultura, representado dentro de la comunicación de esa entidad corporativa, ya sea Starbucks o General Motors o quien sea, ¿verdad? Embraer es un ejemplo que me viene a la mente de Brasil. Ellos hacen aviones. Entonces, hicieron una publicidad que indica que Embraer también está buscando la diversidad en sus empleados, ¿verdad? En el cuerpo de ingenieros, en la gente administrativa. Eso es la manera de comunicar que tú como entidad también invitas la diversidad dentro de las cosas que tú estás haciendo comerciales, ¿verdad? Eso es una. La segunda cosa es promover, y no llegué a mencionar esto porque hablé demasiado, pero hay que promover también con las comunidades la responsabilidad corporativa. Es decir, yo estoy involucrado en esta comunidad, yo ayudo a formar escuelas, estoy involucrado en la construcción del agua, ¿verdad? Que haya agua para toda la gente. Estoy involucrado también en microempresas, estoy dando préstamos para que las mujeres, los hombres, la gente que no ha existido, está siendo servido por mi entidad cooperativa, por mi institución educacional, etcétera. Es la segunda manera, la responsabilidad corporativa. Y la tercera, que se distingue para mí con alguna claridad, es que sea auténtica si tú, voy a hablar de esto así. Yo creo que si hay dos personas que están vendiendo hamburguesas, porque de alguna manera hamburguesas se me viene a la cabeza ahora. Si los dos están vendiendo hamburguesas, si uno me dice, bueno, además de vender hamburguesas, yo me comprometo éticamente con los problemas de esta sociedad. O sea, yo soy, volviendo un poco a lo de responsabilidad. Yo me presento, muchas veces no es cierto, ¿verdad? Pero me presento mi distinción entre los dos que manufacturamos hamburguesas es que yo sí soy consciente de lo que está pasando en esta sociedad. Sería, por ejemplo, ¿cuál es la entidad, cuál es el banco ahí en su banco principal? Se me olvida, en mayor.
Pues hay diferentes bancos, pero uno de los principales y que tiene también una responsabilidad social, que es el Banco Agrario de Colombia.
Bueno, por ejemplo, si el Banco Agrario de Colombia dijera o se presentara como que está pregonando pues por la igualdad social en Colombia, que reconoce, por ejemplo, que hay racismo en Colombia y que quiere hacer algo para mejorar eso, pues imagínate eso comparado con otro que dice no me interesa eso, ni hablo de eso, ni me involucro en eso, pues yo creo que hay gente que ya es consciente de que hay problemas, que quieren alinearse con entidades que también son conscientes. Entonces yo creo que uno se da una ventaja en esa área, en ese tipo de abordaje. La Universidad de Florida, lo que hemos hecho aquí es promover, tenemos las personas que están aquí, ya sean mujeres o afro, que nunca se había hablado de ellos, lo que están haciendo, su producción académica, sus actividades comunitarias, pues ahora están siendo promovidos. ¿Por qué? Porque el estado de Florida se está haciendo más y más diverso. Entonces, la entidad tiene que corresponder, alinearse con los cambios sociales que se están haciendo. No sé si le pude contestar su pregunta.
No, perfectamente. Igual también muchísimas gracias por compartirnos esta parte de las relaciones públicas y también de cómo esto también ayuda en un papel fundamental en las corporaciones, más que todo de negocios, en el tema de como Ford Motorsports o como lo hace Starbucks, y también haciendo lo que es esto, la fidelización de los clientes a través de la humanización de las empresas.
Sí, mira, una cosa, y gracias por el reconocimiento, lo aprecio mucho. Y hay una cosa, porque la gente se pensaba aquí inclusive, bueno, nosotros, ¿por qué tenemos que tener diversidad? Digo, estamos funcionando y todo va bien. Mira, y descubrieron dos cosas. El mercado afro en Estados Unidos, el mercado, así, consumidores, es más de 1.5 trillones de dólares. Compramos casas, compramos coches, compramos ropa. Bueno, dijeron, oye, estamos perdiéndonos de un mercado muy grande aquí. No es buena voluntad, no tiene que ser buena voluntad. Es cuestión de dólares, ¿verdad? De ganancias. Entonces, si el abordaje así como ustedes que están en esta área, pues si lo abordan así, no es una discusión pues sobre racismo, no, eso no es la discusión, es una discusión financiera. La Universidad de Harvard, cuando se puso en cuestión por qué están haciendo acción afirmativa, algunos dijeron, bueno, mejor universidad del mundo, no tienen que, olvídense de estas cosas. Harvard respondió a la Corte Suprema de Estados Unidos, dijo, si nosotros queremos tener éxito en el mundo, tenemos que tener gente que viene de China, de Pakistán, de Latinoamérica, tenemos que tener gente el mundo, porque estamos en todo el mundo, queremos tener influencia en todo el mundo. No lo podemos hacer si no somos diversos y si no tenemos representación de esos países, de esas etnias y todo eso en Harvard University. Lo hicieron deliberadamente para poder ser exitosos en su emprendimiento, que es ser la mejor universidad del mundo. Eso es el asunto.
Gracias, doctor Leslie.
Well, Professor Leslie, we are grateful because your participation in this master class, and I'm so glad to hear you once again. I hope meet you probably in Florida or in the university, or receive you here in Bucaramanga or in another corner in Colombia. And thank you very much once again for accept our invitation.
Well, you're most welcome. It's been a pleasure, a delight, and I promise you that I'll come to visit you. I intend to be in Colombia again, probably in December, and then after, yes, and so maybe during that time we can meet in person again.
Okay, thank you very much, and for all our items in YouTube channel of UPB BGA. So remember, this is our second master class from the subject public relation here in the University Pontifical of Bucaramanga in Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and have a nice day.
Bueno, a todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias.